"That's not Mommy. You, Mommy." He said, "That's funny, lady." And I thought, well, I hope that's a
They exuded charisma, chemistry, and laughing, making them appear to be the ideal pair on TV. But something much more agonizing was happening behind the scenes of Bewitched. Dick York abruptly disappeared from the show, and Elizabeth Montgomery never mentioned him again. Fans were left wondering what really transpired for decades. Why would she never again collaborate with him? What caused such a profound and long-lasting rift? The true tale has now come to light after all these years, and it is more tragic than anyone could have predicted. Bewitched seemed completely different when it debuted on television in 1964. It was already pleasant to think of a lovely suburban witch concealing her abilities to appease her mortal husband. However, the chemistry between Dick York and Elizabeth Montgomery, the show's two main characters, was what really made it shine. In Hollywood, Elizabeth Montgomery was already a rising celebrity. She had established a reputation for portraying intelligent, intellectual, and somewhat enigmatic ladies. She was the daughter of movie icon Robert Montgomery. Audiences immediately adore the grounded elegance she brought to the role when she joined on to play Samantha Stevens. In contrast, Dick York was a well-known character actor who had earned his reputation in radio, theater, and hundreds of television programs. His portrayal of Darren Stevens is so memorable because of his quick wit, profound charisma, and subtle comic timing. Even while responding to Samantha's ridiculous magical mistakes, York had a kind of friendliness and everyman appeal that made him instantly approachable. Behind the scenes, Bewitched's early years were exciting and carefree. Montgomery and York clicked right away. They had no romantic relationship. Despite being married to producer William Asher, Montgomery and Asher had genuine banter on work. Co-stars remembered them easily bouncing off one another and laughing together in between takes. On TV, their unspoken beat was evident. Bewitched was a huge hit in those initial seasons. It was constantly in the upper echelons of the ratings. And both York and Montgomery received high marks for their performances from critics. Samantha's soft humor and Darren's frustrated responses looked natural. However, the magic that occurs on screen is rarely permanent. Things behind the scenes gradually started to change even as the cameras recorded humorous, lighthearted moments. Only a select handful initially recognized the subtle tension that was going on beneath the surface. On film, Dick York's smile never wavered. In actuality, though, he was starting to feel the weight of something far heavier. Furthermore, Elizabeth Montgomery did not readily accept weakness, even though she came across as kind in public. Dick York was fighting a ghost that followed him around with every step long before he ever stepped foot on the Bewitched set. His life was altered by a single incident in 1959 while he was filming the Western drama They Came to Cordura. York and a number of other people were driving a handcar, the type used to manually push rail lines, in a physically taxing setting. The heavy metal handle swung back violently when one of the team members lost hold, crashing viciously into York's spine. Later on, he said, "I felt like there was an explosion inside my back." A damaged muscle along his spine caused the damage instantly, and the effects lasted a lifetime. York persisted instead of seeking long-term care or taking a break. Actors were expected to endure chronic agony throughout that time period. A cycle of painkillers, chiropractic adjustments, and sheer resolve began for him. He was already living in a precarious balance and silently coping with his anguish when he was cast in Bewitched a few years later. However, that delicate balancing act would soon become practically impossible due to the demands of a popular television program. Few people noticed in the beginning. Even when his back was screaming in pain, York had a remarkable capacity to look happy and intelligent. He would film his scenes with comedy and enthusiasm, then slump into a chair between takes, sweating profusely. In order for him to rest in between scenes, stagehands started storing folding cots close by. In order to reduce his physical movement, scripts were revised. In order to conceal the fact that York frequently supported himself by bracing himself against furniture, directors skillfully angled the camera. At first, Montgomery was accommodated by the production crew, which was headed by William Asher, Montgomery's husband. They gave him time to recuperate, rearranged the filming schedule, and urged him to get any assistance he required. However, under pressure, the luxury of waiting wears out, and television moves quickly. York started to accrue missed days. There were times when he was just too ill to come in. On other occasions, he showed up but was unable to finish a scene. York remained warm throughout it all. Even when the agony got intolerable, he didn't complain and continued to be courteous to everyone on set. But others, particularly Elizabeth Montgomery, started to feel the effects of his battle. She first expressed sympathy, but by season 4, her tone allegedly shifted. She started to separate herself from York, according to several crew reports. Their once playful exuberance became chilly. Some claimed that the frequent schedule changes annoyed her. Some people think she thought York's illness was taking too much focus away from the other actors. Her patience looked to be wearing thin, for whatever reason. Additionally, the mood on set grew colder as York's body failed more frequently. However, that was only the start of what would turn out to be one of the most devastating divisions in classic television. The fissures behind the scenes had begun to develop by the 4th season of Bewitched. What had started out as a friendly workplace had turned tense. Every day on set became a mental and physical struggle for Dick York. His failing health, the demanding shooting schedule, and the pressure to perform all combined to produce an underlying frustration that was impossible to conceal with any amount of film wizardry. Once friendly and involved with York, Elizabeth Montgomery had become notably aloof. She had a reputation for being professional, dedicated, focused, and committed to maintaining the show's seamless operation. However, her tone changed, according to people close to the production. She frequently stayed to herself rather than smiling or cracking a joke between takes to greet York. Some hypothesized that she was emotionally separating herself to shield herself from the everyday turbulence that had started to characterize the charmed set as a coping mechanism. Some were less giving. There were rumors that York's absences had annoyed Montgomery and beginning difficulties. According to others, she felt constrained by the frequent rewrites and reshoots. Her husband, executive producer of the show, William Asher, also had an impact. Asher, who was known for his tough demeanor, allegedly had several arguments with York. His main goals were to maintain the show's profitability, efficiency, and tightness. And that objective was starting to be hampered by York's erratic health. Before filming a complex scene, York, visibly tired and squirming in agony, requested a brief break, according to a former crew member. According to reports, Asher rolled his eyes and left the set. Such moments conveyed a very obvious message. York has a limited amount of time left with the show. Although Montgomery never voiced any grievances in public, her quiet was quite telling. Personal interactions had decreased, and the camaraderie that characterized the early days had vanished. Off camera, their relationship had cooled, but on camera, they shared scenes. There was tension in the air even when York gave passionate performances, even enduring excruciating agony to do so. On certain days, you could feel it between takes because it was that thick. York kept showing up in spite of everything, frequently defying the doctor's orders. He was no longer the laid-back, vivacious co-star from season 1, but he truly liked the part and believed in the program. He was altered by the anguish. His face and his movements betrayed the tension, as well as how infrequently he now grinned off-screen. Elizabeth was also changed by the combined strain of a difficult marriage to the show's boss and a high-pressure production. Their formerly sincere bond had deteriorated into something aloof, formal, and protective. Then the time came when that increasing separation became irrevocable. It was during season 5's production when everything changed. For months, Dick York had been barely surviving. Despite his unable to walk, dragging himself to the set, his body finally failed on a specific day in 1969. They were recording a straightforward scene, nothing unusual, in front of the entire cast and crew. York was delivering lines as Darren Stevens while standing in the kitchen set when he abruptly became pale and began to shake. Then suddenly he fell to the ground. The team hurried in. Production ceased. There was a period of total silence in the studio. All that happened was that he was sent to the hospital. He never made it back to the Bewitched set. Official pronouncements lacked specificity. Health issues were the studio's excuse, but the truth was more nuanced. York himself stated that he wished to return. Later, he said that he pleaded with the producers for a few weeks off so that he could recuperate and assured them that he could complete the season. However, that call never materialized. Rather, the company revealed a few days later that Dick Sargent will be replacing Darren Stevens. A drastically altered portrayal of the character, one that many fans never came to terms with. The modification was not explained on the screen. No farewell show. As though he had never been there, York just vanished from the series. The quiet was even more painful as the abrupt replacement. Elizabeth Montgomery never made contact. No note, no letter, no visit. Their collaboration ended silently after 5 years of working side by side. Some thought that York's replacement was William Asher's move, a fresh start that would enable the show to continue. Others, however, took Montgomery's silence more seriously. Was it indifference, guilt, or frustration? Nobody is positive as of yet. Not once did she publicly address York's departure. Dick York was devastated by the abrupt rejection. He had devoted himself fully to the position, frequently at considerable personal expense. In the end, earning a farewell was insufficient. There was a lot of conversation behind closed doors. A few members of the cast quietly sympathized with York. Others subtly acknowledged that having someone more physically dependable in the position was a relief. However they felt, the message was unmistakable. No one was allowed to discuss York's departure. The switch was startling for the fans. York, however, experienced a personal heartbreak. He had been forced out of his favorite role, abandoned by those he had referred to as co-workers, and severed ties with a co-star whom he had admired, if not loved. And in the years that followed, Elizabeth Montgomery's quiet would only become more agonizing. Elizabeth Montgomery herself, as well as the producers and media, were utterly silent following Dick York's abrupt exit from Bewitched. The formerly vibrant, albeit complex, working relationship came to an abrupt end. York later said that she never called him, never spoke to him in a nice way, and never even sent him a message. Furthermore, the quiet was not fleeting. For the remainder of their lives, it persisted. York initially made an effort to be hopeful. He continued to speak of Montgomery with admiration and reverence in interviews years afterward. He characterized her as professional, personable, and gifted. He never publicly chastised her. He was careful with his remarks, even when he was asked how their relationship ended. He once quipped, "I went my way and she went hers." However, there was a profound melancholy that persisted behind those remarks. It was a different story behind closed doors. York told close pals that he had made an effort to get in touch. In an attempt to make things right, he sent a letter, possibly several. He never received a response. For all the hours they had spent together on set, those closest to him said the lack of response was the most painful thing. She didn't appear interested in making amends, despite all the jokes and laughing in the early seasons. Even now, it's still unclear why Montgomery remained silent. Some assumed that it was done out of loyalty to William Asher, her former husband, who had apparently grown weary of putting up with York's health problems. Others think she might have been angry at the way York's illness affected the show's momentum and that, in her opinion, he had become more trouble than he was worth. Others question whether the problem was more intimate. In the early years of filming, there were reports that York had fallen in love with Montgomery, but these were never verified. According to some, his feelings for her might have transcended friendship, but she didn't return the favor because she was married and preoccupied with her own life. She might have wanted to remove herself from him after he left the production, if there was an emotional gap. The outcome was indisputable, regardless of the cause. York never again collaborated with her, never again communicated with her, and never once was his pain or his departure acknowledged. Amazingly, though, he never showed resentment. He spoke honorably about Montgomery till the end of his life. Even after several decades, Elizabeth's quiet seemed to be more powerful than words. And as York gently slipped out of the public eye, the truth about their relationship became increasingly convoluted. Dick York never got another part of that magnitude after Bewitched. Actors who could no longer keep up, particularly those with chronic health conditions, were quickly forgotten by Hollywood. York's injury, which had plagued him for years, continued to worsen. And without a reliable source of income or a strong support network, his life took a tragic turn. He was almost retired from acting by the middle of the 1970s. The offers had ceased, and the physical agony had grown intolerable. He married Joan in 1952, and the two of them lived in relative obscurity. She stuck by his side through all of his hardships, even physically carrying him when he couldn't walk. In a world that no longer had room for him, their relationship served as his mooring. The financial hardship was severe. York and his spouse were on the verge of poverty at one point, depending on disability assistance and meager residuals. They occasionally had to decide between groceries and medical care. Though he never voiced animosity, he called those years humbling. Not in the direction of Elizabeth Montgomery, not in the direction of Bewitched, not toward Hollywood. In fact, York continued to speak kindly about her even while they were silent. In one of his last interviews, he said he hoped Montgomery had a good memory of him and called her a beautiful woman. He never struck back or attempted to damage her reputation, despite being specifically questioned about their distance. However, Dick York's last years saw a significant change in his legacy. Despite spending a large portion of the 1980s and early 1990s confined to his bed, he made an effort with what little energy he had left. He established the nonprofit group Acting for Life with the goal of assisting the homeless. He organized funds, made phone calls, and encouraged others to support the cause from his modest Michigan home. Even while his body continued to deteriorate, his spirit remained alive because of the task that gave him meaning. According to friends, he remained kind, upbeat, and compassionate even during his darkest hours. His voice, which Bewitched fans could still recognize, had become softer without losing its sincerity. He never lost hope that the distance between him and Montgomery would eventually close. That perhaps, just possibly, they may get back in touch before it was too late, but time was running short. Dick York died of emphysema-related complications on February 20th, 1992. His age was 63. Far from the bright lights of Hollywood, far from the renown he had known, and still separated from the lady who had co-starred with him in his most famous part, he passed away in his wife's arms. He never displayed any resentment, though, if he had any in those last days. York departed in silence, but Elizabeth Montgomery's silence persisted until the abrupt and unanticipated end of her own life. Following Dick York's departure, Elizabeth Montgomery's career flourished, but her attitude changed. She was still well-known and captivating on film, but she became more circumspect when discussing Bewitched. She spoke about her experience on the show in interviews for years, but she never once specifically named York. Not casually, not thoughtfully, not even when asked outright. It appeared to be a willful omission to outsiders. Furthermore, her silence was perplexing to people who were aware of York's previous proximity to the series' center. What could have caused two actors who had previously shared a great deal of screen time, laughing, and trust to become so estranged over time? Some thought she was guilty for not talking about York. Perhaps she felt bad about how quickly he had been replaced, or the lack of action taken to help him as his condition deteriorated. Others were positive it was motivated by bitterness, that she held him responsible for the disturbance on the set, for lost shooting days, or for jeopardizing the production flow of the show. Others believed it to be something far more private, something that was never included in behind-the-scenes shows or tabloids. Insiders speculated that Montgomery was torn, that she had respected York but was unsure of how to deal with his suffering, that she had first made an effort to be understanding and patient. However, she detached herself as a means of self-preservation due to the growing stress in her personal life, particularly her complicated marriage to William Asher. Asher was her supervisor, not just her spouse, after all. She might have been more impacted by his annoyance with York than anyone recognized. Another theory is that Montgomery just did not want to relive the most challenging periods of her career. Especially in her final years, she was infamously private. She rarely discussed conflict, preferring to concentrate on her family, her philanthropic endeavors, and the overall legacy of the series. Her complete silence on York, however, was still a mystery. Many people questioned whether Montgomery would eventually break the taboo when she was ill in the mid-1990s, possibly providing some introspection or paying homage to the guy who had contributed to the beginning of Bewitchd's enchantment. Side by side, but she never did. Elizabeth Montgomery died of colon cancer on May 18, 1995. She was just 62. Her final interviews contained the same measured silence that had surrounded her since Dick York's departure from the show, with no reference to him, no reconciliation, and no parting remarks. It was the sort of quiet that begs inquiries